Welcome back. In this video, we're going to study together Daniel 2, verses 24 to 30. Let's read the text. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, "Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret this dream for him." So, having received revelation of the king's dream from God, Daniel goes to Arioch and he tells him, "Don't kill the wise men, take me instead to the king." Notice that Daniel is concerned not only to save his own life, but also to save the life of others. And this accords with God's plan for Israel, which was to be a blessing for the nations. We read next that Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, "I found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means." The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" I want you to notice, first of all, that Arioch, in taking Daniel to the king, takes credit for finding Daniel, whereas we know Daniel was the one who initiated going to the king because God revealed the dream to him. Notice that he also refers to Daniel as a man among the exiles of Judah. And Daniel is also referred to by his Babylonian name Belteshazzar when the king asks for him. I think these are pointers that he is an outsider and a marginalized person in this dominant Babylonian society. And this would have been relatable for God's people who would suffer oppression under foreign empires, not just under Babylon, but under the Persians who would come later, the Greeks who would come later, and the Romans, but particularly the Greeks, especially during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC, during the time of the Maccabean revolt. Daniel is written to God's people faced with such hardships, and the intention is to communicate the message that despite their present difficulties, God's the one who's still in control, and God will have the final word. Daniel communicates this message also to God's people today, who are marginalized and oppressed for whatever reason, whether because of their race or social class, or because of poverty, or because of their faith or their religion, or because they're immigrants. The book reminds us that despite our present marginalized or oppressed circumstances, the God of Daniel is in control and he will have the final word. Notice also that the king asks Daniel, "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" You see, both Daniel and Arioch had left out the important requirement of first telling the king what he saw in his dream before interpreting it. And that was what he had threatened to kill the wise men for failing to do. So the story builds some suspense here as to whether Daniel will be able to do this important thing that the king requires. Well, let's keep reading the story. Daniel replied to the king, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery that he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you were laying in bed are these." So Daniel responds by agreeing with the king's wise men that no wise man can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. And mystery simply means a secret, something that is unknown, that God alone understands and has to reveal to mortals. Despite Nebuchadnezzar's power and wealth, and having on retainer a large number of all the categories of wise men educated in the best of Babylonian literature and education, Nebuchadnezzar was not able to get the answer to this mystery or question about his dream that troubled him, and this made him desperately anxious and filled him with fear and anguish. So Daniel agrees with the wise men that no mortal can answer your question, king. But where Daniel differs with the king's wise men is that whereas the wise men said only the gods could reveal it, but the gods do not dwell with mortals, Daniel says, but there is a God in heaven, namely Daniel's God, who, despite being from the heavenly and not the earthly realm, this God will in fact condescend to reveal mysteries to men on earth. And then Daniel explains to Nebuchadnezzar that this God has, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, shown Nebuchadnezzar what is about to happen in days to come. Daniel then proceeds to begin to tell the king what his dream and the visions that passed through his mind as he was lying in bed were. Joe Sprinkle writes, Daniel was asked to do what the king requested of the diviners. Unlike Arioch's self-promoting statement of verse 25, Daniel's response shows humility in order to exalt God. Daniel echoes the truth proclaimed by Joseph in Genesis, who also interpreted prophetic dreams. God and God alone, not human wise men, can interpret dreams. So, as an aside, notice that Daniel is parallel to Joseph. He's a Hebrew boy forcibly removed from his home to an imperial center, Egypt in Joseph's case, Babylon in Daniel's case, and this Hebrew boy interprets dreams for a foreign king. I think we're intended to see that God is working through Daniel as he did through Joseph to save and preserve his people. And whereas Joseph does so by preserving himself and his family through a time of famine, Daniel preserves God's people through human kingdoms by conveying God's message that God is in control and showing them how to live in light of that reality. But as Joe Sprinkle points out, Daniel, unlike Arioch, gives the praise to God. He does not take any of it for himself. We continue reading in verse 29. Daniel says, As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation, and that you may understand what went through your mind. Daniel explains that as the king was lying in his bed, his mind turned to what was going to happen in the future. And God, the revealer of mysteries, Daniel's God, showed the king what was going to happen. See, before going to sleep, the king had been thinking about the future, and his dream had reflected his own thoughts. But God had also been speaking to the king through a dream which to some extent had a natural explanation. The suspense, however, as to whether Daniel could tell the king exactly what the dream was is prolonged, because Daniel doesn't immediately proceed to tell the king the content of the dream that showed the king what was going to happen. But instead, he proceeds to explain that this mystery has been revealed to Daniel by this God, not because Daniel has greater wisdom than any other human being, such as the wise men of Babylon who were unable to reveal the mystery, but in order that the king may know the interpretation of the dream and understand the thoughts of his mind. Notice that Daniel is unlike Arioch, not seeking or claiming honor for himself, but having attributed the revelation of the dream to his God, explains the purpose of this revelation, which is to help the king understand the dream. You see, Daniel is directing the king's gratitude and praise away from himself and towards Daniel's God, who is graciously helping Nebuchadnezzar to understand his own dream and to know the future. See, Daniel's God is not just a revealer of mysteries to Daniel, but also to Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel's God is also being gracious to this pagan king. As Sprinkle says, though Daniel is inherently wiser than the diviners, he references Daniel 1:20, which says that in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of the wise men, he found Daniel and his friends 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. So though Daniel is inherently wiser than all the others, the wisdom to explain Nebuchadnezzar's dream is God's, not Daniel's. Daniel wishes to give all the credit to God, not his own cleverness. And we remember in Daniel 1:17 that we're told that God gave these young men learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, but Daniel he gave understanding in all visions and dreams. And so Daniel gives the credit to God. Before revealing the dream and its interpretation, Daniel gives all the praise to God. In humility, he understands that his purpose in Nebuchadnezzar's court and of all the gifts that God has given him is to point to the greatness of his God. In our next video, we'll study Daniel 2 verses 31 to 45 as Daniel describes the king's dream and interprets it for him. See you then.